Hi, and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you the books that I read in August, and I'm very excited about it. There were some really good ones in here. And so if you like this kind of content and other homeschool content, please remember to subscribe, and let's get into these books. Okay, I made it through 4 books this month, which was really hard, but I'm determined to keep this goal, and so I pushed myself and we got through the books. And so I'm really excited to share them with you. So the first one is Better Than Happy. My fingers are marking pages here, so just ignore that. But this is by Jody Moore. And I read this book because I went to Time Out for Women. I mentioned this last month because I read another book for someone that was speaking there. But it's an event for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You can go if you're not a member as well, but they're usually discussing more church-oriented things or relating like what Jody does as a life coach towards church-related things because she's a member of the church. And it was really good. So I read the book in preparation to hearing her speak, and I loved listening to her speak in person, and I really loved this book. So it's connecting with divinity through conscious thinking, Better Than Happy. And I haven't ever listened to her podcast. She has one that's, I think it's called Better Than Happy, and it has tons and tons of episodes on it. I'm not very good at listening to things, but I know a lot of people love it, so you can check that out. In this book, I feel like it's a little bit more catered towards members of the church. I feel like you can still understand it if you're not, but there might be some church terms that might be a little bit more difficult, or you might not know what they mean if you're not a member of the church. So just remember that. But some of the biggest takeaways I got from this is she talks about our thinking and how our emotions are not just all of a sudden there, or it's not somebody else's fault. Our emotions are coming from our thoughts. And so we need to evaluate our thoughts or change our thoughts and know that we have control. I think that's the biggest thing, is realizing that we have control. And I've mentioned this before when I've talked about parenting and how sometimes we're like, well, that's just the way my kids are, or this is just how things are gonna be, which yes, everybody has their own personality, their own temperament, but you also have control of the situation being the parent to put forth rules and different things like that. And until you realize that you have that power, that you can, create those boundaries, then it's really hard to change anything. If you don't like a behavior your kid is doing, you have probably taught them to do it. And until you realize that, okay, this is my fault, which is totally okay, all of us do this, then it's really hard to change it. And that's kind of her idea with these thoughts and these feelings. Until we realize we have control over our emotions, it's really hard for us to do anything about it. And so she has, throughout this book, tons of these little models right here. It's hard for me, I don't want to lose my spot over here, but so in here it talks about the circumstance, so what's going on. So in this one it says, I'm having stomach pain during my pregnancy. So the thought, I know I can ask the Lord to help me figure this out. The feeling is curious and hopeful. And then there's an action, I pray to ask for help, and then I speak with people I think might have solutions. And the result, I am open to noticing the solutions that the Lord helps provide, which goes back to the thought. So this is one where they've kind of reconciled and they're looking for a positive in a difficult situation, right? She gives tons of ones where you're just immediately negative, and how she thought, so her son is very much like me, I think. He's younger, a lot younger, but in personality, very much an introvert and just loves to be at home. And for a long time, she's not that way. Jody is an extrovert and wants to be social, and she would try to push him towards certain things, and he didn't want to do it. It was uncomfortable for him. And I know the feeling because I grew up that way, having a mom that was social and me not being social. I'm like, this isn't fun for me. I'd prefer to just be at home and things like that. And so she always had this negative view of her son, and till one day she's like, okay, maybe this is okay. Maybe it's okay that he's like this, and it's not gonna ruin him for life. And so once she started to do that, she started to see him in a more positive light. And she mentioned to her husband, like, look at how great our teenager is doing, and look how great he is. And her husband was like, he's always been great. And just how she missed it because of the negative spin she was allowing that thought to create and then flow into her emotions. And so she gives so many examples, which I think is so helpful. I'm a person that I need to see it in an example to be able to understand it. And so she goes through here and talks about that. And when she speaks in person, she gave some really great examples how our feelings are us. They're coming from us. They're not something externally. Otherwise, we'd all be feeling the same thing in any given situation, and we do not, okay? And so they're coming from us. We have that power to be able to change them, to do something different. And if we don't realize that we do, then it's gonna be really hard for us to change them. And then I just really thought this quote was cool. It's talking in a chapter about forgiveness, but she had a friend, and this was her response to talking about love, because they're talking about relationships, and sometimes you have to let the relationship go. That's part of this process of having the feeling, having the thought, the circumstance you're in and what's going on is there's different solutions. Sometimes it's not about letting more people into your life. So it says, love is considering everyone involved. When we operate from love, we are acting as the Savior does. Love doesn't give everyone what they want all the time. Sometimes love says no, sometimes love sets boundaries, but love doesn't do these things to be vengeful. It does so out of, love, okay? So just the importance of everything I've even shared with you is that focus of love. Sometimes we have to set boundaries because of love. Sometimes we might not be able to interact with certain people because of love, because it's too hard for us or it's too hard for them, and that's okay. So she just wants us to understand our emotions are okay to feel, to allow ourselves to feel them, and then to think through them a little bit. But if you wanted to, I haven't looked into her life coaching sessions. I believe she does most of things online. But if you wanted to have her help you, you could do that. She's great. Like, I loved her. I don't know her personally, but I loved listening to her at the conference I went to, and I loved reading her book. Okay, so the next book that I read was French Kids Eat Everything. And I've had this book sitting on my shelf for a while just because I have a few kids that are a little bit picky sometimes. They're getting better. And so I don't even know how I fell upon this book. I didn't fall on it. That sounded really weird. Anyway, but usually it's through other books that I find more books, and so I'm sure that's where it came from. But I really enjoyed this book. So it's talking about a family who the husband is French and the wife is Canadian. And so they decide to move back to his little town in France for a little while with their two young girls. And their girls only like certain things to eat, and they have tons of snacks and, just all these different things. And this book was great because for several reasons, but I also just didn't know a whole lot about French culture. Like, I know the food is very important to French culture, but reading about this taught me so many new things. So again, I don't have time to go into everything. We'd be here like for 5 years, but read the book because it teaches a lot about those things. But she talks about basically her girls having to adjust, and how in France by age 2, most of their kids there have eaten so many different types of foods. Okay, and they eat everything. They're very healthy. They have a very good relationship with food because of how everything is set up. And then there are some things that are a little bit regimented. Okay, she is a little bit more not that way, the mom. So that kind of stuff was a little bit harder for me. For me, I'm like, oh, maybe I should have been born French because I am a little bit more like, this is the schedule and this is what we're doing, and that works well for me. But anyway, so it was just funny, and my husband was like, what are you talking about? But I really like this book, and she does they only lived there, I think it was about a year before they went back to Canada, but they took a lot of things back with them as far as the things they had learned, and their girls became much less picky over that year. They had a better relationship with food. But it was very, very hard at first because it was just so different than how they had grown up. And so in the back of this book, she does give a few recipes that worked well for her, because I guess when babies are really little in France, they give them purees of vegetables and stuff. Like 4 to 6 month old babies, they're giving purees of things. And so there's like a spinach puree, there's a beet puree, and just to get them used to the flavors, and just very simple flavors. And I like these recipes too because recently I found out like that I have an inner ear disease, and it's helpful for me to not eat a lot of salt. And they don't put tons of salt in a lot of their recipes because they want the flavors of the food to come through. And so I've actually made some of these recipes, and I'm feeding them to my baby, and we've eaten some of them. So far it's already worked for us. But I really enjoyed this book. Again, you pick and choose kind of what works best for your family, but I liked the ideas behind everything in it. Okay, the next book I read was CloudCuckoo Land. This is a big book, guys. It's a little hefty. We're discussing this in book club pretty soon. And so that's why I read this book. And it's by the same author as All the Light We Cannot See, which is a World War II book. And to be honest, it's not my favorite World War II book. I have read it, but it wasn't one that really stuck with me like The Nightingale did, or Unbroken or Unbreakable. Unbroken, I get the names, the titles confused with the movie. Anyways, and so those ones are my favorites, and that one wasn't as much. But so this book, I have mixed feelings about it. We'll see what after book club, sometimes that is helpful for me to discuss it. But it is, maybe if I understood a little bit of mythology a little bit better, maybe some things would make more sense. The storyline is a little bit confusing and complex, and there's a lot to remember because it's following 3 different time periods and 5 different people, okay, within those time periods, and discussing what's going on and how they all kind of converge in a certain way. And so yes, some of those storylines I enjoyed reading a lot more than others. So there was one from Constantinople in, I don't even know if it was the 1500s, it might have been earlier than that, but they're talking about things going on there, and the language changes obviously between these time periods because the language does change in real life. And so some of those were a little bit harder to understand as you're trying to like switch between the different languages, the different circumstances, the different things they're describing. So some storylines became more interesting. I was like, oh, I'd actually prefer to read this one or have more information about this storyline. And there is one that is from the future of a girl that's on a spaceship. And that's one of the ones I was like, oh, I want this more from this storyline. This one's really cool, and I wish I had more from that storyline. And then there's some that's more like our time period, modern day type stuff going on. And so the whole thing is amazing the way it's written. The first like 300 pages were a little bit harder to get into. Like I still enjoyed reading the book, and it's fairly easy to read since it's switching between characters so often. It like makes chapters really short and then they put like 3 pages in between each chapter, so you've already made it to page 20 and you've hardly read anything, so that's great. But the second half of the book, the other 300 pages, was actually a lot better, you know, as you're getting more intense into these stories, as they're kind of coming to a head, all this type of stuff made it a lot more fun. So I still recommend reading the book, but no, it is a little bit more complex. There's a lot of things to keep track of and different things like that, but I'm excited to go to book club and just kind of see how everybody felt about the book and the thoughts about it and things maybe that I missed that other people understood better than me, like the mythology that runs kind of throughout the book. So anyway, I would still recommend reading it because I thought it was a good book and very well written. Okay, so the last book I read was Smart Parents, and I really picked this book just because it was a quick read. It has very big words, and there's not, you know, some of the pages it's like half full, so that's why I picked it, because then I could get through it. But this is Smart Parents, Parenting for Powerful Learning. There's things that I really enjoyed in this book. Again, this is true for all books, I feel like, and other things not so much. It does talk about how like public school nowadays is a little bit more focused back in the Stone Age, I guess. It's not the Stone Age, really. I was born in the 80s, but you know, basically that 80s and 90s to kids nowadays, that's the Stone Age. And how it hasn't quite updated to where we are now, at least technology wise. And so part of this book talks a little bit more about using screens and how we could utilize screens more, like because games can adjust to kids learning in school. You know, it's really hard for one teacher to teach students that are at various levels of learning without making some feel like they're really dumb and others be bored to death because they don't get it. But if you use certain programs then those programs can adapt to where that student is at. And then the teacher doesn't have to sit down with every single student or feel like they're missing somebody because they have these computer programs, which I understand that. I also just don't want my kids in front of screens all day long if that's the way it was gonna go, for them to just be solely on screens, because that helps cater to all kids learning. So it's tricky, right? It's a tricky thing to navigate in public school. And the book does start talking about a growth mindset. And in order for our kids to really grow up wanting to learn, we need to instill in them that growth mindset. So instead of telling kids they're so smart, right, you praise them for the work they put into it. That helps show that they can learn things, right? Their brain doesn't just shut off and, nope, you're as smart as you're ever gonna be. Like, you have the ability to still continue to learn, to continue to grow, and all those things. So it gives some ideas of how you could instill that in your kids. And I believe this is a blog, which is why it's kind of formatted this way. I haven't ever looked at it before. And they just took bits and pieces and put them in a book. And so I think if you have a digital version, there's spots here you can click and there are links, to go places or to see a full story, because they don't share all the full stories in here. But then they go through and they share a whole bunch of different ideas. They share real life stories. They give you things to think about of people implementing different technologies and how those work. But then it also talks about how technology as a tool is it's a tool for creation, and not simply just for consumption, okay, which I totally agree with. I remember taking a class or something where that was something, I think it was a homeschooling conference that I went to, and one of the teachers there talked about creating kids that aren't just merely consumers of technology, but that they're creating stuff too. They create blogs or YouTube or stuff like that, where they're not just sitting here, I'm just gonna mindlessly watch something, but they're also creating things. So that could be a way where technology can be used in a better way, instead of them just sitting in front of a screen doing nothing or mindlessly scrolling. And then it also gives I guess it's kind of the second half of the book, which again made it easier to read. I'm like spitting everywhere, just ignore that. But that also made it a little easier to read, because the second half goes through some tips for different age groups. And so let me see what it says at the beginning, because I can't even remember what they called this section. But so the first section is modern learning and modern parenting. So again, bringing technology forward basically, and how to teach our kids different things that will help them learn, like creating their own pace, their own path, which is an advantage of homeschooling, right? They give some tips for finding schools that might do that, but it's a little bit harder to find schools that do that. But if you're homeschooling, which they talk about a few spots, not a whole lot, then it's a little bit easier to create that, where they're following their own interests. But then it goes and gives this smart parent toolkit, using the toolkit. And then so it goes through young learners, exploring learners, middle school learners, and young adult learners, which I think this part is really helpful, because then it talks about what might be technologically appropriate. Is that even something people say? I don't know. For kids in certain age groups. And like little kids, how much should they be watching, or what should they be doing, or how can you help them to create their own path and define their own interests and things they like to do and stuff like that. So it gives ideas for that. And it talks about, I don't have middle schoolers yet, or kids that have cell phones, but once they do, it gives a whole checklist here of things to look for. So it says check text messages. And I loved at the end that it's like, I am the parent all day, every day. And I think that's important. Our kids, yes, you don't want to invade their privacy. They still need some sense of privacy, but they are still just kids. Even as teenagers, their brains are not fully developed. They don't really understand complete consequences of things or what can happen in the world. You are still their parent all day, every day. And so there's still rules, there's still boundaries, there's still things with technology that have to be established. So while I would not love having my kids in front of screens all day, every day, and I don't necessarily think this book is strongly advocating that, but technology can have its place. I still liked a lot of points that were made in this book about encouraging our kids to find things that are interesting to them and how technology nowadays allows them to do that more freely. And you can find some schools, if you're not homeschooling, that they can do that in as well. Okay, so those were the books I read this month. I learned a lot. I had a lot of fun and a little bit of stress trying to finish them all, but we made it through, so I was glad for that. So if you enjoy seeing these types of videos, remember to give me a thumbs up, and remember, I'm always open to more book suggestions, so leave them down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.